Picture a loaf of bread. Not a good loaf. Not the kind you're thinking of right now, wherever you are, warm and horizontal and hopefully drifting. Not that kind. Picture a loaf the colour of old newspaper. Dense. Heavy in a way that bread isn't supposed to be heavy. A loaf that costs 1 penny and weighs about 2 pounds and smells, if you get close enough to smell it, like a wet basement and something else underneath that you can't quite name and don't quite want to. Now, fill that loaf with alum, with chalk powder scraped off a schoolroom wall, with bone ash from the rendering yards at the edge of the city, where they boil down dead horses and dogs and things worse than dogs into something fine and white and odourless enough to sell to a baker who needs to make his flour go further. Add a handful of ground up plaster, some sawdust, if the week has been particularly bad, a measure of powdered rice that hasn't seen a rice paddy. It's been cut with something even cheaper than rice, though the man who sold it didn't mention that part. Mix it all together with water that came out of a standpipe shared by 200 people. Run your hands through it. Your hands that have touched everything in this bakehouse tonight, and you don't want to think too hard about what everything includes, and put it in an oven running at whatever temperature God feels like providing, because the damper is broken and the flue hasn't been swept since before you arrived, and the whole thing runs a little hot on the left and a little cool on the right, and you've learned which spots to use for which doughs. Shape it into loaves. Sell it to the people waiting outside at 6 in the morning. The people who've been waiting since 5:30, because if they don't get here early, there won't be enough. Sell it to the woman with the 4 children and the shawl she pulls around herself like armour. Sell it to the old man with the cough who comes every day, rain or freeze, and pays his penny with hands that shake so badly the coin rattles against your palm. Sell it to everyone who can't afford anything better. And when they ask what's in it, and some of them do ask, because the rumours have been circulating, because a man wrote something in a newspaper, because someone's wife read it out loud at the gin house down the lane. When they ask, you look them in the eye and you tell them, flour, water, salt, that's all. That's what you tell them. And that's Henry's history for sleep for tonight. So, I make these history stories, and most of you are probably listening to this because you want to stop thinking about your own problems by thinking about someone else's much worse ones, which honestly is a completely reasonable coping mechanism, and I respect it entirely. Some of you are asleep already, and if so, good for you. This topic isn't the most relaxing in the historical canon, but stick with me, because what happened in the bakeries of 1850s London isn't just a story about bad bread. It's a story about desperation, about a system so efficient at grinding people down that the people at the bottom of it didn't just survive on almost nothing. They sometimes profited by selling almost nothing to people who had even less. It's a story about what happens when hunger meets chemistry, and the result is a white, heavy loaf that looks like bread, costs like bread, feeds you like bread for about half a day, and then quietly, slowly, over years and years of eating it every single day because there is genuinely nothing else, does something to you that bread isn't supposed to do. And it's a story about a night in 1857 in the Bermondsey district of South London, in a bakehouse that officially doesn't exist in any historical record, but is absolutely typical of approximately 300 similar operations running at that exact moment in that exact borough. You work there, get comfortable, here we go. The bells are already wrong. That's the first thing you notice when consciousness drags you back up from sleep, and you need to understand something important. In 1857, wrong bells mean something specific. There are dozens of churches within earshot of where you're sleeping, and you've learned all their personalities over the 14 months you've been in Bermondsey. St. Mary Magdalene rings sharp and fast. St. George the Martyr has a low wobble on the third strike that makes it sound uncertain. The little chapel off Long Lane has one bell that hasn't been tuned since approximately the Restoration, and announces every hour like it's personally offended by the passage of time. The bells that wake you now are St. Mary's. 2 o'clock. Your whole body knows what 2 o'clock means before your brain finishes catching up. Your feet are already swinging off the side of the straw sacking that counts as your mattress. Your hands are already finding your shirt in the dark, the coarse linen that's been washed twice since you arrived, and is at this point more of a social convention than a garment. Your feet find the floor, cold flagstone, even in August, because the cellar is always cold, and you stand up. Your back immediately registers its objection. Your back has been registering objections for about 11 months now, since roughly the third week, when the novelty of the new position wore off, and you began to understand what standing at a kneading trough for 6 hours does to a spine that was designed for something other than this. You ignore it. This is also something you've learned. This cellar where you sleep, you and Ned Hicks, who has been here 4 years and sleeps like he's already dead, flat on his back with his mouth open, one arm thrown over his face, is directly below the bakehouse. You can hear, even now, through the stone ceiling, the murmur of the night's first sponge beginning to work. Mr. Alderton set it going before he went upstairs to sleep, which he does for approximately 3 hours between 11 and 2, then comes back down and doesn't sleep again until the afternoon. You've done the maths on this. Mr. Alderton sleeps at most 5 hours out of every 24, has done this, he says, for 31 years. You look at Mr. Alderton, who is 53 years old and looks 70, whose hands are so rough with dried dough and old flour that they feel like sanded wood when he grips your arm to correct your technique, whose lungs make a particular sound when he breathes deeply that you've started recognizing as something specific and concerning, and you don't know whether to admire him or be terrified by the vision of your own future. Probably both. You splash water on your face from the bowl. The water is cold and has been cold for hours and doesn't become any more pleasant just because you've had time to anticipate it. You find the candle on its shelf. You're not allowed to light it until you've found it by touch, because Mr. Alderton says a man who can't navigate his own cellar in the dark is a liability, and strike the flint. Light comes. The cellar swims into existence around you. The flour sacks stacked against the left wall. 14 of them, which is 2 days' worth at full production, which will be down to 11 by morning. The shelf of additives in their paper-wrapped parcels, the barrels in the corner. Ned still asleep, apparently unaware of the laws governing apprentices in the bakery trade, which technically require him to be awake by now. The low ceiling, the damp smell that lives down here regardless of season, a smell that is the specific combination of old flour and cold stone, and something organic that you've spent 14 months trying not to identify precisely. You pull on your apron, canvas, waist length, already stiff with the ghosts of 100 previous nights' work. You take the candle. You go up the narrow stone stairs to the bakehouse, and the heat hits you like a wall. Here is something nobody tells you about baking bread in 1857. The bakehouse is hot. I need you to understand what hot means in this context, because the word doesn't fully carry the weight. It's not uncomfortable hot. It's not the kind of hot where you push a window open. There are no windows to push open. The bakehouse is essentially a sealed box. Brick walls, brick floor, low brick ceiling, built around an oven that has been burning more or less continuously since 1841, when the previous owner built it, and which runs at a temperature that would blister your hand in 15 seconds if you put it directly inside. The air temperature in the bakehouse at 2 in the morning, in August, is somewhere around 110 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 43 degrees Celsius. That's hotter than the hottest day ever recorded in Britain's history, and you're going to stand in it for the next 6 hours. You feel it the moment you step through the door at the top of the stairs. It presses against you. It fills your lungs differently than cold air does. Thicker, drier, it coats the back of your throat with something that tastes faintly of char and iron. Your skin responds immediately, prickling all over, sweat starting before you've even done anything. The oven is on the far wall. It's a brick construction about 8 feet wide and 4 feet tall. The firebox at the bottom fed through an iron door that Mr. Alderton opens with a hook, because touching it bare-handed would be an education in pain you don't need. The baking chamber's above the firebox, accessible through a lower iron door, and it's in there that the first sponge of the night is resting in its covered bowl, beginning the slow process of becoming dough, or something like dough. The oven itself is original to the building. That means it was built in 1841, which means it predates your birth by approximately 4 years, which means that every structural quirk it has developed in 16 years of continuous use is simply a permanent feature of reality and not something to be questioned or repaired. The left side runs hot. The back runs cooler. There's a spot near the front right where the temperature drops unpredictably for about 10 minutes every few hours. And if you haven't accounted for this when calculating your baking times, you end up explaining to Mr. Alderton why the front right loaves are gummy at the core. You have explained this once. You did not explain it again. The light in the bakehouse comes from 2 tallow candles mounted in iron brackets on the wall, and from the glow of the oven, which throws everything in orange and black. Your shadow is enormous on the back wall, moving when you move, filling the room with a version of you that looks, you always think, like something from a woodcut of hell. Which is, you suppose, approximately accurate. You go to check the sponge first. The sponge has been working for 3 hours. You know this because Mr. Alderton put it on before bed at 11, noted the time on the small chalkboard that lives on the wall beside the oven, and wrote his name underneath in a hand that's surprisingly neat for a man with those hands. Next to his name, he's drawn a small cross, which is his shorthand for "Don't touch until I say." The cross is still there, which means you're not to touch the sponge yet. But you can look at it. You lift the cloth, heavy linen, flour grey, and hold your candle over the bowl. The sponge is a mixture of flour, water, and a small quantity of yeast. In a good bakery, the yeast would be fresh from the brewer next door, thick and active and smelling of warm fermentation, alive with the specific biological energy of organisms doing exactly what they were designed to do. In a very good bakery, the flour would be milled from wheat, grown in particular conditions, and would have a particular protein content that gives the final bread a particular character. Chewy and light, and with a crust that sings when you tap it. This is not that kind of bakery. The yeast, first of all, has been stretched. There's yeast in the sponge. You can see it working, can see the bubbles forming and releasing at the surface, can smell the sharp fermented edge of it. but there's less of it than there should be. Because yeast costs money, and the sponge will rise eventually even with less, it just takes longer. And Mr. Alderton has the time. He has always got the time. Between the hours of 2 and 6 in the morning. The flour. You look at the flour, which looks exactly like flour. White. Fine. Slightly dusty in the way flour is dusty, with a faint cloud around it when you move the bowl. It smells like flour. It behaves like flour. If you took a small pinch and rubbed it between your fingers, it would feel like flour. Silky. Fine. Powdering away to nothing against your skin. It is not entirely flour. This is the knowledge that arrived on your 3rd day and has been sitting in your chest ever since, like something swallowed that didn't go down right. Not sharp, not immediately painful, just present, just there. The thing is, Mr. Alderton didn't hide it from you. He's not a man who hides things. He showed you the shelf of paper parcels the first morning, unwrapping each one in turn with the particular care of a man introducing his tools, and he told you what each one was and what it was for. This, he said, lifting a small parcel of fine white powder, is alum. He held it up. He looked at you the way a schoolmaster looks at a student. He's not convinced we'll understand, but who he intends to inform regardless. Potassium aluminium sulfate. The millers use it. The bakers use it. Everybody uses it. It makes the bread white, and it makes the bread heavy, and it makes cheap flour behave like expensive flour, which is what the people who buy bread from us want to see. He paused. Whether they want to eat it is another matter, but they want to see it. You looked at the parcel, small enough to fit in one hand, enough to treat several batches. Is it safe? He looked at you, not unkindly, but with the particular expression of a man who's been asked a question that he's already stopped allowing himself to find complicated. It hasn't killed me yet, he said. Put the kettle on. Let me tell you about the shelf. The shelf on the left wall of the bakehouse, below the flour sacks and above the barrel of water that comes from the standpipe in the yard, is about 3 feet long and 8 inches deep. It holds 8 paper-wrapped parcels of various sizes, a small box that once contained tobacco and now contains something else, and a notebook that belongs to Mr. Alderton and which you are not to touch. You have, of course, read the notebook. 3 weeks in, on a Sunday morning when Mr. Alderton was at church, he goes every Sunday, which is one of the things about him that consistently surprises you. You spent 40 minutes sitting on an upturned barrel reading his careful handwriting. The notebook is mostly recipes, ratios and temperatures and timing notes, the accumulated wisdom of 30 years of baking in conditions that required creativity. But in the back, in smaller writing, there's a list. The list is headed in his careful hand, additives per 4 stone of flour. 4 stone is 56 pounds. That's a day's flour. The list reads alum, 3 ounces, bone phosphate, 4 ounces chalk dust, 2 ounces sulfate of copper, trace, for yeast vitality, ground rice, lintons, 8 ounces potato flour, 12 ounces, and then, at the bottom, in different ink that looks newer, as if he added it later, plaster, 2 ounces, only when lintons is short. You read it twice, then you put the notebook back exactly as you found it, with the particular care of someone who doesn't want to have a specific conversation. Let me tell you what that list means. Per 4 stone of flour, that's 56 pounds. Mr. Alderton is adding 29 ounces of materials that are not flour. That's almost 2 pounds of not flour in every 56 pounds of what he sells as flour, which sounds like it might not be very much. about 3% by weight. And listen, if you're already half asleep, you might think, 3%, that's nothing, that's barely a thing. Here's the thing. Bread in 1857 in Bermondsey costs 1 penny a loaf. A working family in Bermondsey, a tanner's family, say, or a rope maker's family, or the family of a man who works at one of the leather dressing yards down by the river and comes home every night with his hands the colour of autumn leaves from the bark liquor. A family like this spends roughly a quarter of its total weekly income on bread. Not on food. On bread specifically. Because bread is what keeps them alive. It is, in the most literal sense of the phrase, the staff of life. Breakfast is bread. Dinner, if there is dinner, involves bread. The children's mid-afternoon hunger is answered with bread. The thing that stops the stomach ache that comes from going too long without eating is bread. An adult in a working-class Bermondsey household in 1857 eats approximately half a pound of bread per day. A working man, more. Children, somewhat less. A family of 5, father, mother, 3 children, consumes roughly 2.5 pounds of bread per day. 2.5 pounds every day of a product that is approximately 3% chalk dust, bone ash, plaster, and alum. Over a week, that family has consumed, along with their bread, roughly 1/3 of a pound of materials that God did not intend for the inside of a human body. Over a year, roughly 17 pounds. Over a childhood, if you're one of those 3 children, from the age of 2, when you stop drinking primarily milk and start eating primarily bread, to the age of 14, when you leave for a position somewhere, you have eaten, ground up finely and baked into something that looks like food and tastes approximately like food, roughly 200 pounds of chalk dust, bone ash, alum, and plaster of Paris. And you're the lucky ones. You can afford the penny loaf. The ones who can't afford the penny loaf, the ones who buy from the bakeries that operate 2 streets further into the rookeries, the ones that sell bread for 3 farthings. Those bakeries have different notebooks. The alum is the most important one. It's also the most insidious. Potassium aluminium sulfate makes flour behave differently. It tightens the gluten structure. That's the network of protein that makes bread chewy and springy and able to hold gas bubbles. In a bread with good strong flour, the gluten does this naturally. In a bread with weak flour, cut with cheap alternatives, the gluten structure collapses and you end up with a flat, dense, gummy brick that nobody wants to buy. Alum props it up, makes it behave, makes the cheap flour look like good flour, hold its shape like good flour, spring back in the oven like good flour, develop a golden crust like good flour. It does this at the cost of something you can't see. In quantity, over time, consumed daily in childhood, alum interferes with the absorption of phosphate. Phosphate that is supposed to go to bones. Bones that are supposed to grow hard and straight and strong, while a child's body is building itself from the raw materials available. The bones of children in Bermondsey in 1857, if you could look at them, and increasingly, the men from the hospital at Guy's can, because the children from Bermondsey come to the wards in numbers, those bones are soft in ways bones shouldn't be soft. They bend, they grow crooked. The word is rickets. The word that's used in 1857 for what's happening to the children of the poor is rickets. And the official explanation is insufficient sunlight and insufficient meat and insufficient fresh vegetables. All of those things are true. All of those things contribute. But nobody in 1857, nobody official, nobody with the authority to change anything, is yet saying out loud, in print, in a way that sticks, The bread is also doing this. A man called Arthur Hill Hassel is getting close. But that's for later. You hear Mr. Alderton's feet on the stairs at 2:20. Heavy, deliberate, the particular tread of a man who has been descending these stairs in the dark for a long time and trusts his body to know the way. He comes through the door, he looks at the sponge, he looks at you. "The fire," he says, "you've already added coal." He nods once. He goes to the sponge, lifts the cloth, examines it with the expression of a man reading something in a language he's fluent in. He dips one finger in, withdraws it, considers what he feels. 10 more minutes, he says, then we start. He washes his hands in the barrel. This is Mr. Alderton's ritual. He washes his hands at the beginning of every batch, and only at the beginning, because he is a man who takes cleanliness seriously as a principle, even in conditions that make its practice somewhat theoretical. You wash yours too. At 2:30, you start the dough. This is the part of the night that your body understands the best and your brain has the least to do with. 14 months of muscle memory. Your arms know the motion. The heel of your hand pressing into the dough, not slapping, not punching, but pressing and pushing forward, stretching the mass away from you, then folding it back, quarter turn, press again. A rhythm that takes about a minute to establish, and then becomes almost automatic. The dough starts heavy and rough under your hands, cold from the water, which was never going to be warm at this hour in this cellar. Tacky in the way that dough is always tacky in the first minutes, before the gluten develops and the surface becomes smoother, more cooperative. The smell of working dough rises around you, yeasty and slightly sour, warm from the friction of kneading even before the heat of the bakehouse works on it. The flour dusting your hands and the table fine as talcum. The sound of the dough slapping softly against the wood, rhythmic, almost meditative, if meditation were possible in a room at 110 degrees. Mr. Alderton works beside you in silence. He's faster than you, considerably faster, with a particular twist at the end of each press that you've been trying to replicate for months and haven't quite managed. His dough after 5 minutes looks different to your dough, smoother, more elastic, already forming the faint sheen on the surface that means the gluten is developing properly. You'll get there, or you'll spend your life in bakeries and it won't matter because the bread sells either way. After 20 minutes of kneading, your shoulders are burning. Not the hot, immediate burning of injury, but the deep, diffuse burning of muscles that have been asked to work hard and are doing it, reluctantly, because they have no choice. Your hands have stopped being cold. They're warm now, glazed with a thin coating of dough, the dough itself coating and recoating every crack and groove in your skin every time you press into the mass. Your knuckles have started to feel stretched. Your wrists ache from the angle. You keep going. Mr. Alderton doesn't speak while he kneads. He speaks before and after. During, he enters a state that you have come to think of as the kneading silence, a kind of absorption, his eyes slightly unfocused, his breath steady and slow despite the heat, his hands working with the automatic grace of a craft so deeply learned it's become something closer to reflex than skill. You envy him that. You're not there yet. You're still doing it consciously, still counting the movements, still monitoring the dough for the signs he's taught you, the window pane. When you stretch a small piece thin enough to see light through without it tearing, the gluten is developed. The surface smoothness, the sound of the slap changing from dense and dull to slightly lighter as the structure builds. 25 minutes in, your dough makes the right sound. Mr. Alderton glances over. "Cover it," he says. You cover the dough. You stand up from the table. Your spine makes its opinion known immediately, that familiar ache spreading from the lower back upward. And you breathe. The heat is extraordinary. You're soaked through already, the linen shirt clinging everywhere, the apron dark at the waist, sweat running in your eyes. You wipe your face with the back of your hand and taste flour. While the dough rests, Mr. Alderton goes to the shelf. He doesn't invite you to watch, but he doesn't tell you not to. And over the course of 14 months, you've come to understand that this ambiguity is a kind of invitation. He unwraps the alum first. It's a fine crystalline powder, slightly blue-white, that could pass for very fine salt if you didn't know what it was. He measures it by the small tin scoop that lives in its own parcel. You've seen him use the same scoop every night, always the same number of scoops. The measurement's so habitual that he doesn't count anymore. He just scoops until the internal counter in his body says enough. He tips it into a small bowl, then the bone phosphate. This is where you have to be careful about what you imagine, because bone phosphate in 1857 is made from bones, real bones. They come from the rendering yards at Bermondsey, which are the places where the dead animals of London, the horses that collapsed in the street, the dogs, the cattle from the slaughterhouses, the various other organic refuse of a city of 2.5 million people and their animals. They come from those yards after the fat has been removed and the hide taken, and the remaining structure has been dried and ground. The rendering yards are 1/2 mile away. On a warm night, with the wind from the south, you can smell them. The bone phosphate is cream white, slightly coarser than the alum, with a faint smell of something that your mind categorizes as old without supplying a more specific label. You have learned not to think about it more precisely than that. Then the chalk dust. This one, at least, is innocuous. Chalk is calcium carbonate. It's in the chalk cliffs of Dover. It's in blackboard chalk. In large doses it would be a problem, but in the quantities Mr. Alderton uses, it's inert. It passes through. It makes the bread heavier and whiter and slightly more filling in a way that has nothing to do with nutrition. It makes a penny loaf look like it's worth its penny. Then the ground rice from Linton's. Linton's is a merchant on Tooley Street who sells food commodities to the bakeries of Bermondsey and Suffolk and a handful of operations in Lambeth. The ground rice from Linton's is exactly what it says it is, ground rice, white and very fine. But you've been in this business long enough to know that ground rice from Linton's covers a range of qualities, and the quality varies depending on how the week is going financially for both the baker and the merchant. Some weeks it's clean and smells of nothing particular and behaves like rice flour. Some weeks it has an edge to it, a slight bitterness at the back of the throat, a different consistency that makes the dough handle strangely for the first few minutes. On those weeks, Mr. Alderton sometimes weighs the batch twice instead of once and says nothing, but the set of his jaw says something. Then the potato flour, 12 ounces per 4 stone, which is the largest single adulterate in the batch. This one, oddly, is the most defensible. Potato flour is food. It's starch. It behaves in the oven in a way that's not completely unlike wheat flour. It holds moisture. It gelatinizes under heat. It contributes to the crumb structure. Bread cut with a significant proportion of potato flour is heavier and more filling per penny than pure wheat bread. Whether it's better is debatable. whether it's honest is not, and occasionally the plaster of Paris. 2 ounces, only when Linton's is short, as Mr. Alderton's notebook says. Calcium sulfate, used in building, used in casting, used in 1857 in bakeries across London to make bread white and heavy, and to give it a particular solidity under the crust that a customer, pressing a loaf with her thumb, interprets as good dense bread, when she should be interpreting it as I'm pressing plaster. Mr. Alderton mixes the additives in the small bowl until they're blended. Then he adds them to the dough. He works them in by hand, incorporating them the way you'd incorporate salt, distributed evenly, not concentrated anywhere. The slight grittiness of the powder vanishing as the dough absorbs it. The colour of the dough shifting fractionally, marginally whiter. The dough looks the same when he's finished. It looks like bread dough. Here is the thing you need to understand about what Mr. Alderton is doing. He knows. Not only does he know, everybody knows. The millers add alum to their flour before they sell it to the bakers. The bakers add more. The wholesalers who sell the flour to smaller operations add their own proprietary mixture. By the time a loaf of bread has passed through all the hands it passes through in 1857, the amount of adulteration in it has accumulated through 3 or 4 separate commercial transactions, none of which communicated with any of the others. It is, in the most technical sense, a conspiracy, but it's not a secret conspiracy. It's a conspiracy in which everyone is complicit because everyone is desperate. The miller adulterates his flour because the price of wheat has been volatile, because he has debts, because the baker on the other side of town is buying cheaper flour from a competitor and selling bread for a halfpenny less per loaf, and the customers follow the halfpenny. The baker adulterates his dough because the miller's flour already costs more than he can absorb, because his rent went up 3 months ago, because the standing charge for the coal that fuels the oven doesn't care that this was a bad quarter. The customer buys adulterated bread because they have no choice, because 1 penny is what a penny loaf costs and a penny is what they have. Because the concept of organic whole grain baking won't exist as a commercially viable middle-class preference for another 150 years, and in 1857 in Bermondsey, caring about what's in your bread is a luxury available only to people who can afford to care, which is to say people who can afford a different baker. Mr. Alderton is not a villain in this story. This is important. He is not a man who hates the poor or wants to harm them or takes pleasure in their ignorance. He is a man who has been a baker for 31 years, who learned from his father, who learned from his father's employer, who has watched 3 bakers on his street go under in the last decade, unable to compete on price, and he watched their families become the kind of family that buys from bakeries like his. He has done one calculation once, and then he stopped doing it, because doing it again and again doesn't change the answer. The calculation is this: either he adulterates the bread, or he raises the price, or he closes. If he raises the price, his customers go to the baker down the lane. If he closes, his customers still need bread and they'll get it from whoever will sell it to them for a penny. And that bread will be worse than his because at least Mr. Alderton has standards about what he'll add. He won't add copper sulfate in more than trace amounts. He's seen what copper sulfate does to people who get a bad batch. He won't add iron sulfate, which some bakers use. He won't use flour that's visibly gone off, grey or spotted or smelling of mildew, which some operations will. He uses what he uses because it falls, in his assessment, somewhere between enough to function as a business and enough to function as a human being. That calculation has a name in 1857. The name is trade. 3:30 in the morning. The dough has been divided into loaves and is resting in its tins, rectangular iron forms slightly dented, holding roughly 1 pound of dough each, ranged along the shelf on the right wall. You've made 32 of them tonight. Tomorrow you'll make more because it's Thursday, and Thursdays are slightly busier than Tuesdays for reasons that are never entirely clear but hold consistently. The oven is coming up to baking temperature. This is the part that Mr. Alderton manages personally. Getting a brick oven to the right temperature and keeping it there for the duration of a bake requires the kind of intuition that can't be entirely taught. It has to be felt over years until the heat becomes legible to you the way text is legible, until you can put your hand near the oven door and read from the quality of the heat how many degrees you're looking at and whether it's rising or falling. Mr. Alderton tests the oven by throwing in a small piece of paper. If it chars without catching fire, the temperature is right. If it flares up immediately, too hot. If it just browns slowly, too cool. The piece of paper chars. Mr. Alderton grunts, which is his form of satisfaction. You load the first tray. This part too is technique. The bread peel, a long flat wooden paddle, the handle worn smooth over years, slides under the first 4 tins, lifts them, moves them through the oven door in one practised motion. Too slow and the bread slides off the peel. Too fast and you clang a tin against the oven door and wake up everyone within earshot, and Mr. Alderton says nothing but breathes in a particular way that means he noticed. You found the speed. Not the first week, not the second, but eventually. You load 8 tins in the first session. The door closes. The baking begins. And now there's nothing to do for 22 minutes. 22 minutes. In a bakehouse in the middle of the night, waiting. You sit on the low wooden stool that lives in the corner near the water barrel. The stool has no back. Sitting on it means sitting with your spine supported by nothing, which means that after about 5 minutes your body starts renegotiating the terms of the arrangement, your back curving slightly forward, your elbows coming down to your knees. The heat is constant. Your shirt has dried and re-soaked so many times tonight that it's stopped feeling wet and just feels like skin, slightly heavier than your actual skin. Mr. Alderton sits on a different stool, a slightly better one with a back, which is one of the prerogatives of being the master, and he opens the notebook. He writes in it at intervals throughout the night. Not much, a few numbers, a temperature, a note about the dough handling. You watch him write without watching him watch you watch him. The flour this week, he says, without looking up. Finer grind than last week. I noticed. Linton switched suppliers, or his supplier did. He pauses. Absorbs water differently. You'll want to adjust. By how much? He looks up now, examines you briefly. Feel it out. That's the only way to know. This is his teaching method. Not instruction, exactly. More like navigation hints offered while you're already in the water. The alum, you say, after a moment. He looks at you. Waits. I've been thinking about the alum. Have you? It's not a question. It's an acknowledgement, nothing more. He's heard this before. There's a man, you say. Hassel, Arthur Hassel. He wrote something in the Lancet. I know who Arthur Hassel is. He says, I know what he says. The oven ticks, the coals settle. Somewhere in the street above a cart is moving. The slow rumble of iron wheels on cobblestones, the horse's hooves making the specific sound of a large animal moving slowly in cold air. And, you say. And. Mr. Alderton sets down his pen. And Arthur Hassel is a doctor writing in a medical journal, which is read by other doctors and by people in Parliament who We'll eventually do something and then do something else, and then the regulations will change, and by the time they do I will either be dead or retired, and whoever bakes in this building after me will adjust accordingly. He picks up his pen. What would you have me do? You don't have an answer. That's the problem. You thought about this in the cellar, in the half hour between when the bells woke you and when you came up the stairs. You thought about it on Sunday in the church that you sometimes attend and sometimes don't, and you thought about it during the parts of the service where you were supposed to be thinking about something else. What would you have him do? Raise the price? The customers can't afford the price. Use less additive? The bread won't hold its shape, won't look like bread, won't sell. Close? Then the customers buy from someone worse. The calculation has no clean answer. I know, he says, more quietly, not unkindly. You don't have to say it. I know. He goes back to his notebook. The oven ticks. 22 minutes. 5:45 in the morning. The loaves are out. All 38 of them. You baked a second batch while the first cooled, and a third, smaller batch of rolls that sell better than you'd expect to the people who can afford a roll and a halfpenny instead of a whole loaf and a penny. The loaves are cooling on the racks along the side wall. 38 loaves, each one about a foot long and 4 inches high, golden brown on top, slightly darker underneath where the tin conducts heat faster than the air. They look good. In the yellow light of the bakehouse, they look like bread should look. Substantial, warm, promising in the particular way that bread always promises something specific and satisfying. The smell. The smell of fresh bread is the same in 1857 as it will be in any century. It's one of those things that are chemically identical regardless of what else is happening in the world, regardless of what the bread is made of, regardless of who baked it in what conditions. The Maillard reaction, the browning of the crust, the caramelization of the starches, the hundreds of volatile aromatic compounds released as the heat transforms raw dough into something else, produces the same smell in a slum bakehouse in Bermondsey as it does in the most expensive kitchen in Mayfair. The smell doesn't lie. The smell is pure. Ned Hicks has appeared at some point. You didn't notice the exact moment, which means either you were absorbed in the baking, or Ned moves more quietly than a man his size has any right to. And he's eating one of the broken rolls from the back of the rack, the ones that cracked or collapsed in the oven and can't be sold. He eats without looking at you. This is also normal. Queue's starting, he says around a mouthful. You go to the front of the shop. The shop, the front room, really. A small space between the bakehouse and the street, with a wooden counter and a shelf and a door that is currently bolted, is lightning. The gap under the door, which faces east, is showing the first suggestion of a different quality of darkness. Not yet dawn, but the suggestion of dawn. The kind of light that the sky produces in the hour before anyone who isn't a baker would recognize it as morning. You can hear them outside. Not the noisy crowd sound of the market, not the organized shuffle of a line. Something quieter and more patient than that. A murmur of voices, feet on the pavement, the particular sound of people who've been awake for some time and have arrived somewhere and are waiting without complaint because complaint costs energy that they need for other things. You unbolt the door. The queue is 14 people long, stretching from the door along the front of the building and around the corner a little, shifting and breathing in the early morning cold. Because it's August, the cold is relative. It's perhaps 50 degrees, which after the bakehouse feels almost shockingly cool, the air against your face and arms like water. The woman at the front of the queue is Sarah Hobbs. You know her by sight. She's been first in the queue almost every morning for the 11 months since you've been opening the counter. A short woman, wide through the shoulders, with the red hands that come from laundry work. Raw from the lie, the knuckles cracked and dark in the cracks. She has 5 children. You know this because Mr. Alderton told you back in the beginning, when you were learning who the regular customers were and what they needed and why they were in the queue they were in. 5 children, he said, standing behind you at the counter one morning while you watched her go. Husband works at the tanning yard. She takes in washing 3 days a week. He paused. She has never once, he said, been able to afford a meat day. You didn't ask what he meant at the time. You understand now. A meat day is a day when a family has meat. Some families in Bermondsey have one per week. Better off families have 3. The Hobbs family has the bread you sell them and whatever else Sarah Hobbs can stretch a few pence into across a week. She holds out her penny. You take it. You hand her a loaf. She tests it. You've watched her do this every morning, the same gesture, pressing 2 fingers against the crust at the side, and she looks up at you. Fresh this morning? This morning, you confirm. She nods, tucks the loaf under her arm, moves on. 14 people, 14 pennies, 14 loaves. By the time you reach the end of the queue, the sky is unmistakably changing. The darkness over the rooftops to the east has developed a blue-grey quality that's heading for something lighter. Carts are beginning to move on the main road. The first hawkers are calling something distant and indistinct. The day is starting. Here is something about flour dust. Flour dust is so fine it floats. In a bakehouse, it's always in the air. It coats every surface. It settles in the corners and on the tops of the tins and on the shelf where Mr. Alderton's notebook lives and in the cracks of the wooden table and in the wrinkles of your hands and in your eyebrows. It also inevitably gets into your lungs. Every breath you take in the bakehouse contains flour, not a dramatic lungful, not enough to choke you, just a thin suspension of fine particles, breathed in with every inhalation, all night, every night, shifting as you move, rising again every time you tip flour from a sack, or work the dough or load the oven. This is called, in 1857, baker's asthma. It's well recognised, not as a medical crisis, not as a reason to change conditions, but recognised the way a sailor's broken nose from a boom is recognised, as a professional hazard, as the price of the job. Mr. Alderton's particular sound when he breathes deeply, the one you noticed on your first week, the wheeze that lives behind his sternum, that's the flour. 31 years of flour. You breathe in now, standing at the empty counter after the last customer has gone, and you feel the familiar slight roughness in your throat, the dry quality to your voice in the morning that takes an hour of not being in the bakehouse to clear, the way you blow your nose on Sunday, on the rare days when you're out of the bakehouse for long enough, what comes out is grey. You don't think about it. You close the front door. 7 o'clock. The queue is done. The second rush, if there is one, sometimes there is, won't come until mid-morning. The women who couldn't get here at 6 coming instead at 10 with whatever penny they've acquired. The late morning bread will be from the second bake, the one you started while the first was in the oven. Mr. Alderton eats breakfast. This is the one meal of the day that happens in the bakehouse, at the small table in the corner near the back door that opens onto the yard. He eats bread, not his own bread. This is one of the details you noticed early and found too complicated to ask about directly. He eats bread that comes from a different bakery, a small operation on Grange Road that is run by a woman called Mrs. Pendleton, who he has some arrangement with that you've never quite been able to identify. He eats his bread with a small piece of hard cheese and a cup of something that started the evening as tea and has been reheating on the back of the stove since 3 a.m. You eat your bread. Your bread is from here. This is not a choice. This is simply where you are and what there is. You eat what you make. This is also the case for every working person in Bermondsey who doesn't have the time or the money to go to a different baker. The bread is warm. It has that quality that fresh bread has of being almost soft at the centre. The crumb still slightly yielding from the heat. The crust makes a small sound when you press it. It tastes like bread. This is the honest answer. It tastes like bread because all the things that have been added to it don't have strong flavours in the quantities used, and the dominant flavours of bread, the slight sourness of the fermentation, the complex toasty notes from the crust, the neutral starchiness of the crumb, are still present and still taste like what they are. You eat it. You eat it because you're hungry, because you've been awake since 2 and worked through the hottest part of the night, and your body's asking for fuel, and this is the fuel available. Ned eats beside you. Ned is 24 and has the particular quality of someone who made peace with his circumstances so completely that he no longer registers them as circumstances. He eats with appetite. He drinks his tea. He makes an occasional comment about one of the morning's customers, not cruel, just observational in the way of someone who's seen the same people in the same queue for 4 years and has his own private anthropology of the neighbourhood. Hobbs' woman was asking about the price, he says. She wasn't. Not to you. To the woman behind her. I heard it through the window. You look at him. Saying it might go up again. The price. It won't go up again. It can't go up again. If it goes up, the queue gets shorter. Mr. Alderton knows this better than he knows almost anything. It's not going up, you say. I know. Ned takes another bite of bread. She doesn't know that, he chews. She counts every penny 4 times before she spends it, he says. Not with contempt, with something more like exhaustion. The exhaustion of a person who is close enough to the same edge that he finds the specificity of another person's poverty uncomfortable. Every single penny. You don't respond. You eat your bread. Outside, the morning is properly happening now. You can hear the street beginning to fill, the heavy footsteps of men going to work, the faster, lighter sound of women going to market, the occasional high call of a child. The milkman's cart has been and gone, the rattle of his churns fading down the road. Someone is sweeping a step. The day is ordinary and continuous, and it's going to be just like yesterday and the day before, which is both the comfort and the cost of a life like this one. He comes at 10:30. You're alone in the shop. Mr. Alderton is upstairs sleeping his 3 hours, and Ned is in the bakehouse doing the mixing for the afternoon batch. You're behind the counter, recording the morning's sales in the ledger with careful handwriting. The man who comes through the door is not a Bermondsey man. You know this immediately, the same way you'd know it about any of the neighbourhood's regulars versus an outsider. It's not one thing, it's the accumulation. The coat, which is well cut but not ostentatiously so, in a fabric that speaks of a tailor who knew what he was doing. The boots, which are dry and clean in a way that means he hasn't walked more than a few streets from wherever he arrived. The way he enters, with the particular alertness of a person who is paying more attention to his surroundings than is strictly necessary for shopping, the eyes moving over the space too methodically. He looks at the bread on the shelf. He looks at you. Good morning, he says. His accent is educated without being aristocratic. Southwark, maybe, or somewhere just south of the river, but shaped by years in different company. Morning, you say. I'd like a loaf, please. You take one from the shelf and set it on the counter. He doesn't pick it up immediately. He looks at it. Penny loaf? Yes, sir. Made this morning? About 5 o'clock. He nods slowly. He picks up the loaf, holds it, and you can see him weighing it, not with a scale, but with his hands, the way someone does when they are trying to remember what a particular weight felt like. Heavier than it looks, he says. Dense bake, you say. This is the standard answer. Mr. Alderton taught you this answer. Dense bake, good flour, feeds the family better than a light one. The man turns the loaf over. He looks at the bottom crust. He does something then that no customer has done in all your months behind this counter. He takes a small folding knife from his coat pocket and cuts a thin slice from one end of the loaf. He looks at the interior. He holds the slice up toward the light from the window. Your stomach has gone very still. Do you know, the man says, in a conversational tone that is somehow more alarming than a confrontational one, would be that in the right conditions you can examine a cross-section of bread and see the composition of the flour reasonably clearly? I'm not sure what you mean, you say. He looks at you. His expression is not unkind. The particle structure, the way the crumb holds together, the specific texture around the air cells. He sets the slice down on the counter. He's not threatening you with it. He's just showing it to you. Adulterated flour has a particular look. Once you've seen it a few times, you start to recognize it. He reaches into his coat pocket and produces a small glass tube, stoppered with a cork. He opens it. He takes a very small fragment of bread, less than the size of your thumbnail, and places it inside the tube, then restoppers it. I'm going to pay you for this loaf, he says, and I'd like to take this sample as well. Is that all right with you? What are you going to do with it? Analyze it. You're a chemist? I work with one. He pauses. I work with several, actually. We're doing a survey, bread from bakeries across the borough, trying to build a picture. He puts his penny on the counter, then another penny. For the sample, he says. You look at the 2 pennies. You look at the tube in his hand with the small piece of your bread inside it. What happens after you build the picture, you ask? The man looks at you for a moment, quite directly. We publish it, he says, in a medical journal, then we take it to Parliament. A pause. And then, he says, eventually something changes. You think about Mr. Alderton's answer from last night. Eventually something changes. You think about Sarah Hobbs in the queue at 6 this morning, pressing the loaf with 2 fingers, trusting you when you said it was fresh. You think about 5 children who eat this bread every day. The baker who makes this bread, you say carefully, isn't a bad man. No, the man says. They rarely are. He picks up the loaf. Thank you for the sample. He goes out. You stand at the counter for a moment. Then you put both pennies in the cash box and go back to the ledger. His name is a detail worth knowing. Arthur Hill Hassall, born in 1817, physician, microscopist. In 1850, he begins writing for the Lancet, the medical journal, which at this point has been running for about 25 years and has enough credibility to cause genuine alarm when it publishes alarming things. What Hassall does, what the man with the small glass tube is part of, is systematic. He buys food from shops across London, bread, coffee, pepper, tea, milk, cocoa. He buys them anonymously, the way any customer would, in the quantities any customer would buy. He takes them to a microscope and a chemical laboratory, and he analyses what's in them, and then he publishes what he finds. In bread, he finds alum. In virtually every sample he tests from the poorer districts, not always in large quantities, but present. Present the way a pattern is present, so consistent that its absence would be the anomaly. Sulfate of copper, not everywhere, but enough places to establish it as a practice. Bone ash and bone phosphate, in the varieties of flour being sold to the cheaper bakeries. Plaster of Paris, ground glass in some cases, though you'll be grateful to learn that this is rare. He publishes a table. The table lists bakeries by district, the substances found, the quantities. The table does not include names, and the law doesn't yet allow that in the way that makes it stick, but it includes enough detail that a reader who knows the geography of South London can make reasonable guesses. He also publishes something else, the physiological effects. Alum in quantity causes gastric irritation, constipation alternating with diarrhea. In children, who have smaller bodies and less capacity to excrete what they absorb, it interferes with mineral absorption, the rickets connection, the soft bones, the small bodies bent in ways they shouldn't be bent, the bone ash, not dramatically harmful in the doses used, inert mostly, but the principle of adults who can read these tables making decisions to feed ground bone to children who cannot read anything, that principle is something that doesn't go away just because the harm is small. The plaster, calcium sulfate. In the body, it competes with calcium for absorption sites. What it doesn't take, it displaces. In a child who is already calcium deficient from insufficient dairy, from insufficient sunlight, from a diet composed almost entirely of bread and sometimes a bit of potato, what the plaster displaces has nowhere else to come from. Hassel's Analytical Sanitary Commission, as it comes to be known, runs until 1854, 49 articles in the Lancet. The results become a book, Food and Its Adulterations, published in 1855, 2 years before the morning you're standing at this counter. The book has not yet changed much. The Adulteration of Food and Drink Act will pass in 1860. It will be largely voluntary, which means largely ignored. The more significant act won't come until 1875. In 1857, the bread is what it is. The queue is what it is. He tells you things, sometimes, between batches, not personal things, not the kind of things you'd call intimacy, but history, the history of the trade, the history of this street, the history of bread in this city, which he carries in his head the way he carries the recipe ratios, not recited, but known. He told you once about the flour famines, not the Irish famine, though he talked about that too, once, briefly, with a specific care that you recognised as him deciding how much to say and choosing a smaller amount than he originally intended. He told you about the flour famines in England in the earlier part of the century, when the corn laws were still in effect and the price of wheat was protected against cheaper imports to preserve the profits of landowners, and the price of bread reflected that protection directly. A £4 loaf, he said. In 1800, in a bad year, it cost a shilling. A shilling. You looked at him. And a labourer's wage was what? 12, 14 shillings a week, if he was skilled. 8 or 10 if he wasn't. And a family with children needs how many £4 loaves in a week? You did the arithmetic. It came out somewhere between a third and half of a labourer's weekly wage just for bread. That's when the adulterations really started, he said, not before. When the price of wheat makes bread unaffordable at the real cost of production, that's when you start looking at the shelf and thinking about what can make the flour go further. He paused. The Corn Laws went in 46, he said. Wheat got cheaper, bread got cheaper, but by then the practices were established. The millers had found the margins. The bakers knew the shelf. He looked at you. Things take longer to stop than to start, he said. He went back to his work. The afternoon in the bakehouse is different from the night. In the night, the heat is a sealed thing. The building holds it. The lack of windows means it accumulates. The only relief is the brief breath of cooler air when the back door opens to let you take the ash out. In the afternoon, the sun is on the roof and the south wall, and the already hot bakehouse becomes something else. Not hotter in absolute temperature, the oven still sets the upper limit, but differently hot, drier. The air quality changes in some way that you can feel in your nose and the back of your throat, a sharpness that makes you drink more water, which means making more trips to the yard, which means brief flashes of outside air that feel, in the moment of their occurrence, like the most beautiful thing that has ever happened. The afternoon batch is smaller than the morning batch. 20 loaves and the remaining rolls. These are for the afternoon customers, different from the morning queue mostly. The housewives who send their children with a penny when the morning loaf runs out. The men who work nearby and stop in on their way home. The occasional small order from one of the eating houses on Jamaica Road. You work the dough for the afternoon batch alone. Mr. Alderton is sleeping. Ned is sweeping the front room, the particular rhythm of his broom marking time. You've been thinking all morning about the man with the glass tube. Not guiltily, exactly. Or, guilt is part of it, but not the kind of guilt that comes from having done something you knew was wrong. More the kind that comes from having done something that is wrong in a way you understood intellectually, but not viscerally, and then something made it visceral. Sarah Hobbs's hands pressing the loaf. That's what keeps coming back. She was checking the loaf for quality, for density, for freshness, making the best judgment she could with the tools available to her. She had no tool for the alum. She had no instrument for the bone ash. The things that were hurting her children, slowly, invisibly over the course of years, were invisible by design, not a malicious design, not a conspiracy with an architect, just the accumulated pragmatism of a trade in which the cheapest option survives, and the cheapest option requires additions that nobody talks about because nobody benefits from talking about them. The wheat flour is the visible part of the bread. Everything else is underneath. You knead the dough. Your hands push and fold and push again. The rhythm that has become so automatic that it happens without instruction, your body knowing what it knows. The dough absorbs the additives the way it always does, the slight grit at the beginning, the way the colour shifts a fraction whiter, and then the dough that looks like bread dough, handles like bread dough, will bake like bread dough. You knead it until the window pane is clear. You cover it. You sit on the stool without the back, and you wait. Ned comes back from sweeping and sits on the stool with the back, which is technically Mr. Alderton's stool, but which Ned uses in Mr. Alderton's absence, with the easy entitlement of a man who's been somewhere 4 years longer than his nearest colleague, and considers this to confer certain privileges. You're thinking again, he says. You don't deny it. The man this morning, you say. Ned considers this. He's been in this trade for 8 years. 4 at a different bakery in Lambeth before here. He's 24. He doesn't have your particular habit of trying to find the moral centre of a situation, which is either a character trait or a survival strategy, you're not sure which. Investigator, he says. You saw him? Heard him. Through the wall. He pauses. He's not the first. There have been others. One other. Year before you came. Different kind of man. Older, rougher, more like a government official. Didn't explain himself as much. Just bought a loaf and left. And nothing happened after. Nothing happened after, Ned confirms. He stretches his arms above his head, his spine popping audibly. Nothing will happen after this one either. Not immediately. Maybe in 10 years they'll change the rules. Change the rules and everyone just adjusts. Adjusts how? Other things. Different things. Things that don't show up in the test they designed for the last things. He shrugs. That's how it always works. You look at him. That's a depressing view. It's an accurate one. He looks at the shelf, the paper parcels, the small tin scoop still sitting in the alum parcel where Mr. Alderton left it after this morning's batch. The thing about the alum, Ned says, slowly in a different tone, not philosophical now, more careful like he's measuring his words, is that without it the bread isn't white. I know. And the people who buy from us want white bread. He pauses. White bread means the miller sifted the bran out. It means good flour. Good flour means good baker. Good baker means you can trust what you're getting. He pauses. That's what they were told. That's what they learned. That's what their mothers told them when they were small. Buy from the baker who sells white bread. The other kind's got things in it. He lets that sit for a moment. The white bread is the one with things in it. I know, you say. But they don't. 4 in the afternoon. A woman comes in with a child. The child is perhaps 4 years old. A girl with the large eyes and the slightly prominent forehead of a child who has had insufficient of several important things for an extended period. She holds her mother's hand and looks at the bread on the shelf with the specific focused attention of someone for whom bread is not a background element of existence, but a specific, significant, desired object. The mother, 30 perhaps, it's genuinely difficult to tell, age landing differently on a face that has had the specific life this face has had, buys a loaf. She counts out the penny from a small cloth purse that she opens carefully and holds at an angle, and you watch her count the coins without meaning to watch her count the coins. Is this the fresh one? She asks. This morning's first batch, you say. She takes the loaf. The child reaches up and touches it. The mother lets her hold it for a moment. The child's arms barely long enough to get around it, her face tipping up toward the bottom crust with that instinct children have, and then takes it back and tucks it under her arm. Thank you, the woman says. She says it looking directly at you, which not everyone does. She says it as though you are specifically owed something for providing the thing she needed. You watch them go. The door closes. You stand there for a moment. The bread under that child's nose smell like bread, baked this morning, made by hands that know their trade, made from flour that contains alum, bone phosphate, chalk, ground rice, potato flour, and the specific ingredient that is the most honest word for all of those things mixed together, necessity. 7 o'clock. The last customer came and went at 6:10. Ned has been tallying the remaining loaves, 7 left, which will go to the Holman family 2 doors down who have an arrangement, or will go to waste, or occasionally will be broken up and eaten between the 3 of you as supper, if the accounting works out in a particular way. Tonight there are 6 remaining loaves and 1 arrangement. The 7th loaf goes onto the table. Mr. Alderton comes down from upstairs looking approximately as rested as a man can look on 3 hours of sleep, which is to say he looks like he's been awake for 20 hours instead of 23. He checks the ledger. He checks the remaining stock. He runs his thumb along the edge of the counter with the particular motion of someone who is deciding whether he needs to say something about the state of the counter or whether tonight's not the night. Tonight's not the night. 43 loaves, you say, plus the rolls. He nods. Man came in this morning, you say. Investigator type. Took a sample. Mr. Alderton doesn't look up from the ledger. I know, he says. You know? There's a survey going on. Baker in Grange Road told me. The Board of Health, working with the Lancet Group. He runs his finger down a column of numbers. They'll do the whole borough eventually. What happens after? Publication, then eventually regulation. He closes the ledger. I expect we'll need to adjust the proportions. The proportions? Cut the alum at minimum. Possibly eliminate it. You look at him. The bread won't. The bread will look different. Some customers will complain about the colour, some will adjust. He picks up the ledger and moves toward the stairs. The regulations will specify maximums. We'll work within the maximums. That's all. He pauses at the bottom of the stairs. What else would you have it be? He says. It's not unkind. It's the tone of a man who had been asking himself the same question for longer than you've been alive, and has arrived at the same incomplete answer every time. I don't know, you say. He goes upstairs. The 7th loaf. You, Ned, and eventually Mr. Alderton at the table in the corner near the back door, which is open now to let in the evening air, the first relief from the day's accumulated heat drifting in from the yard. The bread with a scrape of dripping from the jar Mrs. Alderton keeps on the shelf. She's upstairs with the children. Mr. Alderton has 2 children, a girl of 8 and a boy of 6, who you hear in the mornings but see infrequently. Their schedule inverse to the bakehouse schedule. By the time you're finishing work, they're starting school. By the time they're home, you're in the middle of the day's second batch. The bread. You eat it, because it's there, and you're hungry. It tastes fine. The dripping is from a piece of beef that came through last week, and it tastes of that, of fat and meat and something rendered and slightly salty. The taste of protein and comfort that the bread alone never quite provides. You eat, and Ned talks about something else entirely, a card game he wants to organise with a group of men from the tannery down the road, and Mr. Alderton says nothing, but his expression suggests that card games involving tannery workers have historically not resolved themselves in ways that reflect well on the participants. The evening light through the open door is golden. The bakehouse behind you is still warm, but no longer impossibly so. The oven banking down now, the stored heat in the bricks radiating gentler after a full day. The smell of it, the smell of baking and fire and flour is in everything. In your clothes, in your hair, in the grain of the table. It's the smell of the place. And here is the thing about smells. They are almost impossible to be objective about. They carry too much association. The smell of this bakehouse carries the last 14 months, everything you've learned and seen and thought and done. It carries the 2 o'clock starts and the aching back and the conversations over the kneading table and the women in the morning queue and the investigator with his glass tube and the child reaching up to touch the loaf. It carries everything. It smells like bread. Here is what the survey found when it was published. Of 47 bread samples taken from bakeries in the Bermondsey and Suffolk districts in the autumn of 1857, 31 contained alum at levels above what would later be considered safe. 22 contained bone phosphate. 14 contained sulfate of copper at trace levels. 8 contained substances that the analyst described as mineral adulterants of unknown specific origin, consistent with plaster or chalk. The publication caused discussion in Parliament. The discussion produced a select committee. The select committee met for 2 years. It produced a report. The report led to the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860. The act was largely voluntary. Over the following decade, alum use in commercial bread declined, slowly, unevenly, in a pattern that matched the enforcement capacity of local authorities and the economic pressure on individual bakers, which is to say, it declined more in places where enforcement was consistent and less in places where it wasn't. In Bermondsey, enforcement became consistent around 1866. Mr. Alderton retired in 1869. Ned Hicks opened his own bakery in Southwark in 1872. His bread contained some additives and not others. The children of Bermondsey, the girl who touched the loaf that afternoon if she lived, if her bones held, if the summers of her childhood produced enough vitamin D from the occasional hour of sun that got down between the buildings to counteract some of what the bread was doing to her calcium absorption. Those children grew up into adults who eventually ate bread made under regulation. But by then, a generation had already been shaped by what it ate in its formative years, not catastrophically, not in any single acute crisis that could be pointed to and named, just in the small, incremental, cumulative way that a thing absorbed daily for years becomes part of the structure of you. The bones remember. The body keeps what it keeps and discards what it can discard, and the rest becomes part of the architecture. Permanent as limestone, unremarkable as the chalk that was baked into the bread in the first place. 8:30. The bakehouse is quiet. Mr. Alderton is up and at the oven again, checking the fire for the overnight. Not for baking, just for keeping the oven from dropping too far in temperature between now and when he lights it fully again at midnight for tomorrow's first sponge. The science of maintaining a continuous burn oven that has been running for 16 years is its own art, with its own rhythms. Ned is washing up, the sound of water and scraping coming through the wall. You're at the kneading table with a damp cloth, wiping it down. The marble surface of the table, not actually marble, a thick slab of stone that Mr. Alderton refers to as marble regardless of what it technically is cool under your hand. After the heat of the day, the coolness feels significant, real, physical in the way things become physical when they're in contrast to something else. You push the damp cloth along the surface. The flour residue comes up. Old flour, the ghost of the day's work, pale and fine, dissolving into the wet cloth. You wring it out. The water that comes from it is greyish. You do this every night. It's part of the closing ritual, along with sweeping the floor and covering the remaining flour sacks, and latching the front door and banking the oven and putting the additives back on their shelf in their proper order. The shelf. You look at it from across the room. 8 parcels. The alum in its paper wrapper, the small tin scoop resting in the fold, the bone phosphate next to it, slightly cream-coloured under the evening light, the chalk which is the whitest of them, the ground rice from Linton's, which sometimes smells fine and sometimes smells of something with an edge to it. They're just parcels on a shelf. They're just the shelf. And tomorrow at 2 o'clock the bells will ring and you'll come up the stairs, and the shelf will be the shelf, and the oven will be the oven, and the dough will be the Dough and 38 families in Bermondsey will get what 38 families in Bermondsey have always gotten: bread. What goes into it doesn't change its name, doesn't change what it is to the woman who tests it with 2 fingers in the morning queue, or to the child who reaches up and presses her face against the bottom crust, or to the old man with the shaking hands who pays his penny like a prayer. It's still bread. It's still the thing that stands between them and hunger. It's still the reason this bakehouse runs 20 hours out of every 24, 7 days a week, except Sunday when God and the law both insist on a rest. It's still the thing Mr. Alderton has given 31 years of his lungs to. You fold the cloth. You set it on the edge of the barrel to dry. You go to the door of the bakehouse and look back at the room once before you go down to the cellar. The oven glowing orange-red in its grate. The tins on the shelf clean and waiting. The kneading table scrubbed. The shelf of parcels. The candles burning low. It looks like a bakery. It is a bakery. Everything else is also true. Down the stone stairs, the cold comes up to meet you before you've reached the bottom. That particular underground cold that exists regardless of the season. The cold that the earth keeps in its own reserves and rations out through stone. The cellar smells of flour and damp, and the faint organic undertone that you've stopped trying to identify. Ned's boots are in the corner. He leaves them down here, for reasons that have never been explained and which you've never asked about. One candle is burning, nearly to its end. You undress. Shirt, breeches, stockings. The shirt is damp from the day, darker at the back and under the arms, carrying in its fibres everything the bakehouse gave you over the last 18 hours. You hang it on the nail. The straw sacking. You lie down. The stone floor under the sacking transmits its cold through the straw. Not intensely, not enough to make sleep impossible, but enough to remind you that you're lying on a stone floor in a cellar, which is the honest condition of your current life. The cold is fine. After the heat of the bakehouse, the cold is something close to luxurious, like immersion in the most gradual and gentlest water, pulling the heat out of your skin in slow degrees. You lie on your back in the dark and stare at the ceiling you cannot see. You know things about bread that you didn't know 14 months ago. You know the feel of good flour against your palm, and the feel of cut flour against your palm, and you know the difference is small enough that it requires attention to detect, but large enough, once you know what to look for, to be unmistakable. You know the sound the oven makes when it's at the right temperature. A particular quality of the draw, the pull of air up through the flue, audible as a low, steady note under the crackle of the coals. You know that a correctly fermented dough springs back when you press it with one finger, and that a dough that's been rushed springs back too fast, and one that's overproofed doesn't spring back at all. You know the particular satisfaction, and this surprises you, that it's satisfaction and not just relief, of loading a batch and closing the oven door, and knowing, based on everything you've learned, that they're going to come out right. You know all of this. You also know the shelf, and you know that these two sets of knowledge live together in the same person, in the same bakehouse, in the same trade, that they are not in conflict in any way that has a resolution you've been able to find, that the skill and the care and the early mornings and the aching back are genuine, and the shelf is also genuine, and both are part of what the people in the morning queue are receiving when they hand over their penny. You've been thinking about whether this is a tragedy. Here's what you've concluded, lying in the dark in the cellar with the fading cold pressing up through the straw. It might not be a tragedy in the way that word usually works. There's no moment of recognition. No catharsis. No point at which the truth arrives and changes everything. The truth is already there, on the shelf, in paper parcels. It changes slowly, over years, as investigations publish reports and reports produce committees, and committees produce acts, and act produce enforcement, and enforcement produces adjustment. In the meantime, the bread is the bread. In the meantime, the queue forms at 5:30 every morning. In the meantime, children eat what their families can afford. Think about the city above you. Bermondsey in 1857, the tanneries by the river, the largest concentration of tanneries in the world, actually. Processing leather from every animal you can name, producing the characteristic smell that Bermondsey carries everywhere. A deep animal smell of bark, liquor and wet hide, and the particular chemistry of making dead animal skin into something durable. The workers who go home from those tanneries every night with the liquid soaked into their skin. The streets of terraced houses, narrow and close, the upper floors of each building almost touching the upper floors of the building across the lane. The standpipes shared between dozens of households. Water that is not quite clean, coming from a source that is not quite safe, but which is the water available. The Church of St. Mary Magdalene, its bells, the way they ring every hour and you know by their sound what time it is without looking at anything. The bakehouse, the oven, the shelf, the queue at 6 in the morning, 14 people long. Sarah Hobbs and her red hands pressing the loaf. This is Bermondsey in 1857, and it is not a background. It is not a scene setting. These are people living the only lives available to them with the resources available to them, making the calculations available to people with their resources. Penny for bread, another penny for coal if there is another penny, judgments made about quality on the basis of colour and weight. Because colour and weight are the instruments available. The instruments are not sufficient. They are the only instruments. And in 200 years, standing wherever you're standing right now, in your warm place, in your horizontal state, in your century that has regulation and labelling, and the ability to check the ingredients on a wrapper before you buy, you're still connected to this, in the way that all history connects forward and backward through the same basic material. The need to eat, the gap between what's available and what's sufficient, the people who fill that gap with what they have, the decisions made in that gap that aren't clean but are sometimes the only decisions possible. Your eyes are heavy, the cellar is dark. Ned is snoring already. The particular rhythm of someone who can fall asleep the way a stone falls into water, immediately, completely, without drama. The candle has gone out. The sounds of the bakehouse above you have quieted. The oven's low tick, occasional and slow. Mr. Alderton's footsteps back and forth. The creak of the building settling. Outside, somewhere far enough away to be almost part of a dream, St. Mary's bell marks 9 o'clock. 9 sharp strikes, the last one fading into the Bermondsey night. Your body has started the process. It starts every night at this hour. The slow withdrawal from the day that isn't a decision so much as a biological imperative. The ache in your back has become something quieter. The way pain becomes background over time, turning from sensation into simple presence. The body's record of what it has done. Your hands, you feel them, even with nothing in them, even lying still in the dark. The slight roughness of the skin at the knuckles, dried from the flour and the water and the heat. The faint soreness in the heels of both palms from the kneading. The calluses built over 14 months, the skin there harder and less sensitive than it was, the hands that came here belonging to someone else. Your hands know bread now. They know the weight of dough in them, the resistance at the beginning of a knead, when the gluten hasn't developed, when the mass pushes back sluggishly, and the different resistance after 20 minutes, when it's alive with structure and springs back with something like energy. Your hands have touched everything that goes into the bread, both the flour and the shelf, both the real thing and the real thing underneath. Let yourself think about this one more time before you let it go. The woman tomorrow morning, first in the queue, pressing the loaf with 2 fingers. She's checking for quality. She's using the tools available to her. She trusts you, not you specifically. She trusts the bakehouse, the system, the penny for a loaf arrangement that's been stable for long enough to constitute a kind of social contract. She trusts that what she's paying for is what she's getting. That trust is worth something. That trust is worth more than the alum, which costs a fraction of a penny per batch. That trust is the real transaction. And somewhere in the city tonight, in a building that's been identified with the number in a ledger, in a medical journal, in a survey being conducted by a man who carries glass tubes in his coat pocket, that trust is being studied, being weighed, being turned into a table in a report that will eventually be read by people who have the power to change the contract. The investigation moves at its own pace. The queue moves at its own pace. Both of them will still be there tomorrow morning. Centuries will pass. The bakehouse on this street will become something else. The street will widen. The tanneries will close. The smell of Bermondsey, that deep animal leather smell that is as specific to this place as the smell of the oven is to this building, that smell will fade over decades as the industry that made it migrates, then ends. New buildings will rise, different in material and height and the specific logic of their architecture, but built over the same ground, above the same stone that holds the cold that pressed up through your straw mattress tonight. The regulations will come. The bread will change, not all at once, not cleanly, but bread in 1900 will contain less alum than bread in 1857, and bread in 1950 will contain things that people in 1900 didn't know about, and bread in your time will have a list on the wrapper that someone theoretically could read in print small enough to require attention, in language technical enough to require knowledge, and the gap between what's on the wrapper and what a person can meaningfully understand about it is perhaps smaller than the gap that existed at 6 in the morning in 1857 in a morning queue in Bermondsey. Perhaps. But the hunger hasn't changed. The need to eat something affordable today, with the money available today, that hasn't changed. The distance between what a person buying food knows and what the person making the food knows, that gap hasn't disappeared. It's changed shape. The tools for investigating it have changed. The regulations governing it have changed. But the gap itself is a permanent feature of the landscape. It exists because food is complicated and the world is large, and the supply chain between a field of wheat and a loaf on a counter runs through many hands, all of which are making their own calculations, all of which are responding to their own constraints, most of which are invisible to the person holding the penny. This is not a counsel of despair, it's a counsel of attention. Arthur Hassel paid attention, bought a loaf, cut it open, put a fragment in a glass tube, published a table. Something changed, slowly, imperfectly, with resistance from everyone who had a financial interest in things not changing. But something changed. Let the bakehouse go. Let the shelf go. Let the kneading table and the oven and the stone stairs and the paper parcels and the morning queue. Let all of it recede to the middle distance where history lives, large and real and not entirely comprehensible, just present. You're warm now. Whatever cold the straw mattress held at the beginning has been replaced by the warmth of a body at rest, the specific warmth of a human being surrendering the heat of the day slowly back into the world. A fair trade, warmth given and warmth held long enough to do what warmth is for. Your back has stopped talking, not permanently. Tomorrow at 2 it will resume its commentary, but tonight it has said what it needs to say and run out of urgency. Your hands are still. The calluses, the roughness, the slight ache at the heels of the palms. Still, all of it. The hands that know bread. The hands that have touched both the flour and the shelf. They rest. The sounds of Bermondsey are fading, not disappearing. The city never fully silences, even in 1857, even at this hour. Somewhere a cart is moving. Somewhere a dog is making its case to the darkness. Somewhere a baby is beginning a complaint that will either resolve or not, depending on how the night goes. The church of St. Mary Magdalene, sharp and fast, will mark 10 o'clock soon. Before it does, let the sounds of the bakehouse take you, the low tick of the cooling oven, the soft movement of air through the flue, the particular grain of silence that fills a space after the day's work is done, when everything has been cleaned and covered and banked and closed, when the bread is sold and the accounts are tallied and the door is bolted, the bakehouse at rest, the whole city at its softest. You are warm enough, you are fed enough, you are tired enough. You have a roof and a trade and a back that hurts, and hands that know something real, and a window in the cellar that shows a small rectangle of Bermondsey sky where, if the clouds are thin enough, you can sometimes see a star. That's enough. That's more than enough people in this city have tonight. The trade has its complications. The bread has its shelf. The calculations that make it possible to sell a penny loaf for what they are. And you live inside those calculations the way you live inside the bakehouse, surrounded by them, shaped by them, not entirely comfortable with all of them, but not anywhere else. There isn't anywhere else tonight. There is just this. The straw mattress, the cold floor underneath it, the warmth of your own body, the sounds of a city at its most dormant. Tomorrow there will be 2 o'clock, and the bells and the stairs and the kneading and the morning queue. But that's tomorrow. Right now is now. Let the heat of the bakehouse drain away. Let the weight of the bread come down. Let your hands remember that they don't have to be doing anything. Let the flour settle. Let the bells have the night. Let sleep come the way it came to every baker's apprentice who slept in this cellar or any cellar like it, in any city in any year, who came up from the dark every morning and did what needed doing with what was available and went back down at the end of it. Let it come. Let the cold stone and the thin straw and the ceiling you can't see hold you exactly as well as they need to hold you. Let the city breathe. You've earned this. Take it. The bread is made. The queue will form at 5:30, but not yet. Not quite yet. Good night.